Hello GCSE students, this is English Language Paper 2. This time it's question 3 in this series of lessons on the June 2018 paper. Let's take a look. If we share the screen to make it all work, then that is splendid. Right, as I faff around, here we are. There is the question. You now need to refer only to source B from lines 18 to 25. How does the writer use language to describe the surfers and the sea? So some strategic and practical things to do first off. Make sure you're looking at source B. It does happen that sometimes students don't do this, particularly in the pressure of any kind of timed conditions. Then find the lines that you need. And you'll see here that I've taken the liberty of already doing that. They are highlighted. There's a little box around them. And as said in the very first video, there is as much guidance as possible without printing the extract to tell you, well, there's line 18, there's line 25. You know, that's the section to be paying attention to. Now, what sometimes you see students do is they start reading furiously. They're looking down, they're interrogating the passage. And then they start underlining and highlighting things. And that's not necessarily wrong, but the first thing that you must do is answer the question. And the question asks, I've got it this time written down, how does the writer use language to describe the surfers and the sea? So the very first thing that we have to do is say what the surfers are like and what the sea is like. You know, what are they doing? How are they described? So don't start identifying nouns, verbs, or adjectives or anything like that just yet. It's simply what are they like? So even without reading it yet, one can say something like this. The surfers are described as, while the sea is described as. It's not terribly exciting, but it does what it says on the tin. It answers the question. And essentially what we're doing in here is providing some labels. What are the surfers like? They are like this. The sea is like this. Now, if we want to make that maybe a tiny bit more formal, we pay attention to who the writer is and what the writer's doing. So we begin to articulate already at the very beginning that we understand the writer is doing these things on purpose. It's all a kind of construct. So the writer is Bird. So one way that we can immediately kind of just cultivate this idea of a slightly more passive, slightly more formal voice is Bird, use the author's surname, not Isabella. She's not one of our friends. Isabella Bird, you know, she's not Izzy or Is or anything like that. Bird describes the sea as now, I can use the word described again, but we're always encouraging you to try and vary your vocabulary. So we should do the same thing here. Bird describes the sea as, while the, oh look, I've made an error. Oh dear, it's not the end of the world. If anything, I've just demonstrated the importance of reading your work repeatedly. So Bird describes the sea as, while the surfers are revealed to be whatever it is that you think the surfers are like. So that's the first thing that you do. Then you launch into, well, what does the writer use? What are the methods? And so we've done this many times before. Methods. Methods could be individual word choices. It could be adjectives describing words. It could be nouns, particular words, names that are used. It could be verbs, action words. It could be adverbs, words which describe the action. Those are, in many respects, the basics. Beyond that, everything else can be considered to be figurative, or maybe, if we don't like that word very much, no reason not to like it, metaphorical language. So within this categorization, you then have simile, metaphor, personification, symbols or symbolism, anthropomorphism, etc., etc. Now, if you do know what each of these individual things mean distinctly, then that's lovely. That's good. Use them. But if you don't know what they mean, then it's not really the end of the world, because what really matters is meaning. Students who just check off a list of various techniques that they once upon a time heard of, they might get good marks, but only if they consider the meanings of the words. And that's your job. What do these words mean? What do they imply? What do they reveal? Why do we think the writer has chosen this? So the question, if I go back up to the top of the page, is how? How does the writer use language to describe the surfers and the sea? How? And a nice way to think of this is this sort of reasonably mathematical formula: the what plus the why is equal to the how. So some of your teachers will do what, how, why. They're kind of much of a muchness in some respects. What does the writer do? What words do they choose? What method, if you know it, have they opted for? But more significant than the what is the why. Why have they chosen that word? Why have they gone for that particular simile, that particular use of symbol? And if you do the what and the why, then the how begins to take care of itself, at least in part. What you then must try and do is build on it by adding more detail. So let's have a look at the passage at this particular stage. Up here is our model intro, a model introduction. Let's move that out of the way. Move my face out of the way of the top right of the screen. The surfers are described as, has become, bird describes the sea as, while the surfers are revealed to be. Now, and only now, do we begin to articulate methods, but we need to read it. And as we're reading it, what we're looking for is words which tell us about the sea and tell us about the surfers. Fine, but then words which just stick out. They're odd, they're unusual, they stick out like a sore thumb. Or maybe these are words which often have other meanings. And I'm going to give an example of that in a second. And I'm going to help you with the way I read it as well. I'm going to give you a big clue as to what my model will be. So they rode in majestically, always just ahead of the breaker, carried shorewards by its mighty impulse at the rate of 40 miles an hour, as the more daring riders knelt and even stood on their surfboards, waving their arms and uttering exultant cries. They were always apparently on the verge of engulfment by the fierce breaker, whose towering white crest was ever above and just behind them. But just as one expected to see them dashed to pieces, they either waded quietly ashore or, sliding off their boards, dived under the surf and were next seen far out at sea as a number of heads bobbing about like corks in smooth water, preparing for fresh exploits. So, the first one might be a word like this. So they rode in majestically. Now, when you're looking at words like this, what you're required to do is consider the following question. Let's make that a capital. The first question is, what does that word usually mean? What are its typical connotations? And then I'll write this just underneath. How does it apply / what does it reveal? In this case, it's about the surfers, isn't it? Because it says that they rode in majestically. So what does the word majestically usually mean? What are its typical connotations? Now, for the sake of making this video easier to use, I'll write it on the piece of paper. But what does majestically usually mean? I'm pausing there to give you a chance to think, not because you necessarily have to shout out any answers, but majestically, well, majesty implies royalty, which maybe implies that these people are kings. They appear to be male, these surfers. Or do they? Well, kings, let's be kings and queens. And then I start thinking, well, if these people are kings and queens, what are they kings and queens of? Well, they're kings and queens of the sea, aren't they? And what do kings and queens do? What do I know about kings and queens? They rule over everything. They have power. They have control. They have autonomy. Now, you'll see there that I've written the words power and control. Autonomy is the one I added, which is probably my sort of slightly teacher flourish, my teachery flourish. It's the thing that students and people with a reasonable vocabulary will be able to pick up on. Then the reason for my heavy sigh there is you just have to write this down as a sentence. So it becomes a bit like this. If I go back up to my introduction, Bird describes the sea as something, while the surfers are revealed to be. Now, I haven't done anything about the sea yet, but I've got an idea as to potential labels I can reveal about the surfers. They're awesome, they're powerful, well, at least based on this one word. Then I'm turning this bit here, using my what and my why to explain how. So ideally, one needs to know what type of, what word class that majestically belongs to. The clue is that they rode, which is an action, a verb. They rode in majestically. So it's an adverb. Bird uses the adverb majestically. And what I want to try and do here is avoid just repeating the word majestically over and over again, but explain and articulate what that word means. And the work in this instance has already been done. Bird uses the adverb majestically to convey the and scroll down a touch. Bird uses the adverb majestically to convey the almost royal power and control the surfers have over the seas. It is as if they are kings and queens who rule over all they survey with something resembling autonomy. Now, as I was writing there, I was thinking of lots of other things that I was incredibly tempted to suddenly shoehorn into my piece of writing. But I didn't. And I didn't because what I want to demonstrate in this particular instance is that having the ideas is enough, and writing them down as you can see them in terms of the planning is more important in this particular instance. If, however, you do have more ideas about what these surfers are like, then you add them. Of course you do, because essentially what you're trying to do here is show off as much as you can. Show off your knowledge. So what does it mean to be royal? Well, the things I was thinking there were along the lines of, well, some people believe that a monarch is chosen by God, and therefore if these people are chosen by a sort of a higher power, then maybe they too are sort of otherworldly. Maybe they are from another stratosphere. Maybe they just are sort of somehow grander or bigger than the seas. And isn't that a funny thing? Isn't that a slightly ironic thing, perhaps, to consider how a person on a tiny, flimsy piece of wood could possibly be bigger than the seas? Maybe I could then use that to contrast to the way that some of the rest of the passage uses language. And so the next step is to begin to make connections. They rode in majestically. We've covered that bit, but we are told that the sea is mighty. We're told how it moves incredibly quickly, 40 miles an hour. We are told that they ride in majestically, but how the writer expects to see them dashed to pieces. We are told that they were always apparently on the God knows why I've missed the V out there, but the verge of engulfment. We are told that just as she kind of expects to see them sort of bashed up and obliterated, dashed to pieces, then suddenly they slide off their boards, dive under the surf, and the next scene, far out at sea, as a number of heads Oh, bring the as in. There's a simile. A number of heads bobbing about like corks in smooth water. So what I'm beginning to do here is highlight some of the words and phrases that you probably would be expected to look into, to interrogate. There are many more. Why are these people, for instance, uttering exultant cries? Why are they so happy? Why are they so joyous? The sea is described as having a fierce breaker whose towering white crest was ever above and just behind them. So look, here are some of the words and phrases that you should be considering. When you consider them, you are looking at what does the word usually mean. So what does towering usually mean? Straightforward enough, one thinks, I hope. How does that word towering apply? What does it reveal, towering in this instance, about the sea and about the surfers? What is engulfment? What does it mean usually if one is engulfed? So how does that word engulf apply to this particular question about the sea and about the surfers? And that's really it. The key is to continue to develop your responses. It's not just about coming up with one word. Oh, I think the word majestically, majesty, that means royal, so that implies that they're like kings. Okay, it's not wrong, but the way that you develop your marks and climb that ladder quite quickly is by picking up on these other ideas. Royal, that you're kings and queens. In this instance, they're the kings and queens of the sea. What do kings and queens do? They rule over everyone and everything. They have, therefore, power and control and autonomy. If I take that a step further, then there's this rather strange description of how these surfers are almost in control of the natural world itself. How a man on a flimsy piece of wood, or a comparatively flimsy piece of wood, is in control of the seas themselves. And maybe this is because the word majestically implies the sort of otherworldly nature of being a monarch. Some believe that monarchs are chosen by a god, and perhaps this explains why Bird has chosen this word. However, this is contrasted to the other violent language in the rest of the passage, and so on and so forth. And I'm beginning to give myself a chance to get into those top end marks, something above the mark of 10, between 10 and 12, because I'm being increasingly perceptive, but I'm also adding detail to it. So either I continue with this point here and I build upon it, and I build upon something with phrases like this. How something is accentuated, it's made more of, it's reinforced, it's added to by something, through something, with something, by words that the writer has chosen on purpose. Or I introduce an element of contrast. And in this instance, I think contrast is easier because the word majestically contrasts with something like dashed to pieces. But there you have it, really. That's what you're trying to do, is build upon your ideas. So in the next part of the thing to do, the next part of this is to now consider what each of these particular words means, these phrases. Start with the ones which are circled, they're there to help you. And then begin to look at some of the other words and phrases that are in the rest of the paragraph and add more detail to it. So after this, it's a case of get writing, get practicing. That's it for now. Hope it helps and hope it makes sense. Thanks very much. Bye.